Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Welcome back to our series on the most important battles in the Civil War. We were in the middle of the Vicksburg Campaign. Grant and Sherman had a genius plan to attack Vicksburg from two fronts, but Grant was continually being harassed by Nathan Bedford Forrest, so he wasn't able to successfully reach Vicksburg. So now we're going to come to the third attempt to take Vicksburg, and we'll see if it works well and finally breaks a blockade, and the Union can now access the entire length of the Mississippi River. Beyond that, cut off supplies that the Confederacy has access to the west in Texas and down into Mexico, possibly issuing a crippling blow to the Confederacy. James, do they issue that crippling blow in this attempt?
Well, you're just going to have to wait to find out.
The suspense is killing me. We'll see.
All right. So we saw last time, as Scott mentioned, that Grant and Sherman had decided just to march down from Tennessee. They were on the eastern side, the Mississippi side of the Mississippi River, and they marched down. And they were about to attack, and their supply lines were messed up, especially Grant's. Nathan Bedford Forrest made it to where Grant had to go back and retreat. Sherman was repelled by a Confederate force. So back to the old drawing board, do-over. But Grant was smart, especially in a military sense, and he realized that if you just do the same exact thing, you're going to get the same exact result. So he comes up with a new plan. This time, he and the army are going to march down the west side of the river. So they're going to be in Louisiana, which was a little bit safer for Union forces. You didn't have Nathan Bedford Forrest riding around the swamps of Louisiana like he was in Mississippi, and it wasn't going to be easy for him to get over there. So Grant is going to quickly try to march down the west side of the river. The river fleet is going to come down, and when they get to the Vicksburg and they face the batteries, the mighty guns that are part of the city's defenses, they're going to just run right by them. They're going to run the gauntlet, get past the batteries, and then once they're on the south side of Vicksburg, they're going to ferry the soldiers across the Mississippi so that they would be south of the city. All right, so let's do a mental map for our listeners. I always say this: if you can, pull out an actual map. Get one off Google or whatever, Wikipedia. But if you're driving, then please don't do that. Instead, imagine the Mississippi River running right down the middle of your map, north to south. Vicksburg is on the right side or the eastern side of the river. So this time, instead of coming down that same side, Grant's going to come down the left side of the river, the west side of the river, and he's going to come down. And at the same time, the Union fleet is going to come down, and it's going to go past Vicksburg and just take their lumps. They're going to fire at the defenses. They're going to do it at night so as to hopefully avoid detection, at least for a while. And once they get past the Confederate defenses, assuming they're not all sunk, then they're going to ferry Grant's troops from the left side of the river or west side of the river to the right side or the east side, and then come around and hit Vicksburg that way. All right, so let's see if it works. And again, like I said, it's very risky. I mean, what would happen, for example, if, let's say, the first ship or two is hit and disabled and sunk, and what if they block the river so that the others can't even get past them? They'd be sitting ducks. They'd have to try to turn around and go upriver, which they were steamboats. So it's possible, but it's going to be very difficult and slow. It's a very gutsy plan. Here we see this is one Union commander who is bold and gutsy, and he's not slow and plodding and methodical like so many others we've seen before. As Lincoln had said, we saw this at the end of last episode, I can't spare this man. He fights. Grant is going to fight. And he's just going to find a way. He's determined. All right. He mentioned this plan to his subordinates. They didn't like it. They said it's too risky. They mentioned some of the things that I just mentioned, some of the things that could go wrong. Sherman said, hey, let's just go back to Memphis. And that seems amazing. That seems out of character for Sherman because, as we're going to see, Sherman is pretty aggressive himself. Sherman says, let's just go back to Memphis and get restocked, get resupplied, get ready to go, and really do some more planning, and then start out again. Grant said, no, we're not going back to Memphis. He says that if we go back to Memphis, it would be too bad for Northern morale. The North is tired of Union generals retreating. They've seen almost nothing but that in the East, at least. We've got to keep marching forward. So he does. They start marching down Louisiana, in Louisiana next to the Mississippi River. And as I mentioned, it's very swampy there. But they build corduroy roads, which are basically laying out a bunch of boards, or logs, actually. In most cases, they didn't really take the time to turn the logs into lumber. But they cut down trees. They lay down the tree, the trunks. They're long logs, basically. They lay them down and they walk across there. And that way they're at least walking on something that's hard. And the wagon wheels are not going to get stuck in the mud or in the swamp or anything like that. And that enables them to move relatively quickly. On the evening of April 16th, 1863, the Union River Fleet, now commanded by David Dixon Porter, they decide it's time. And so they steam past the batteries. They go as fast as they can. They go at night. Many of the ships put cotton bales on their decks to absorb the blow of the Confederate shells. And some people call these Cottonclads. We've talked about ironclads a little bit. These are Cottonclads. And some of these ships were ironclad too. But they were hoping that the cotton would absorb and soak up some of the shells that were going to be shot at them. The Confederates, they weren't dumb. They knew they heard the ships coming. They knew what was going on. And so they lit huge bonfires to help them see the ships. Grant's was there with one of his sons, and Grant's son later wrote that it was almost as bright as day, even though it was the middle of the night, because of these bonfires. And so the Union ship is going by as fast as they can, the ships, the fleet, and they're firing at the batteries, and the Confederate defenses open up and they fire at the Union vessels. Every Union vessel was hit. Some caught on fire, but only 8 were sunk. And that's out of 30. So that's pretty good. 8 out of 30. Yeah. So they get 22 out of 30 through, and then they get south of the Vicksburg defenses, and they do exactly what Grant had planned. There were a lot of transports in the group. They ferry the men from the west side of the river to the east side of the river. And now he had 23,000 troops in Mississippi and near the town. Meanwhile, on April 17th, Federal cavalry under a commander named Benjamin Grierson, and we're going to talk about him a little bit more in a minute, but I'll finish up the thought. General Grierson leads a raid into Tennessee. And over 17 days, his command marches 800 miles. They repeatedly engage the Confederates. They disable 2 railroads. They capture many prisoners and horses, and they destroy vast amounts of property. And this also distracted Confederate cavalry from opposing Grant's crossing. So it's kind of a diversion movement, if you will. And this General Grierson is an amazing guy because he's like Forrest in that he had no previous military experience. You know what he did before the war?
I'm going to guess, what's the most uncavalry-like job? Banker.
Well, almost as uncavalry-like. He was a music teacher.
I would say that's even more uncavalry-like. Wow.
Yeah, more playing musical instruments, and this just mild-mannered, gentle guy teaching kids how to play instruments. But instead, he turns into this incredible cavalry. He was another one of these completely unprofessional people that just picked it up, like Forrest. They just had a knack for it.
So Mr. Hollands Opus goes to war. Wow.
Absolutely, and kicks some serious butt and distracts Forrest. He keeps Forrest busy so that Forrest can't go down there and harass Grant as he tries to move his forces over from the west to the east side of the river. So it's a pretty amazing thing. Grierson goes on later to be commander of Buffalo Soldiers after the Civil War. These, of course, were cavalry units that were all African-American that fought out in the West. They fought in some of the Indian Wars, and Grierson was their commander.
The pieces are in place now. I mean, finally, there's been some success in a plan being executed. It's not just retreat back. So, yeah, let's look at it. Let's get into the thick of it.
All right. In early May, General Sherman marches down and joins Grant. He joins the party once again. He's itching for a fight, having lost and been driven back earlier. And now Grant has a total of 40,000 men. And Grant does something, I hinted at this earlier. Grant's tired of supply lines. He sees all this rich, bountiful country around him. He sees these orchards and he sees these big farms and plantations. And so he cuts himself off completely from his supply line, and he lives completely off the land for 2 weeks. No one in the North knew where he was. He had no communications. They didn't know where Grant was. They didn't know where his army was. And I should probably clarify, Scott, for those that don't really, I've touched on this before, but maybe if somebody doesn't really know what I'm talking about when I say cutting yourself off from your supply line. We all know, of course, that an army has to eat. And prior to this, the way Union armies ate as they marched further and further south into the Confederacy is they just brought wagons with them. They had wagons full of supplies coming down from the north toward where the armies were, bringing them the food and the medicine and the ammunition and all that, everything they needed, replacement shoes, replacement uniforms and whatnot. But what Grant is going to do is just get rid of the wagons. He's going to send them back and say, I don't need you. And he's just going to go to farms, and he's going to, shall we say, requisition things to eat for his army. He's going to take what he needs from the surrounding countryside. Later on, we're going to see Sherman is going to epically do this on a grand scale, but Grant is doing it right now. And his chief opponent, as we've mentioned before, was Confederate General John C. Pemberton. He had 32,000 troops with him with which to defend Vicksburg. Now, there was one other small Confederate army in the area that had the potential to cause Grant some trouble, and that was an army under our old friend who we've seen before, Joseph Johnston. Joseph Johnston, who was one of the heroes of First Bull Run, at least heroes from the Southern perspective. He had also been the first army commander who had opposed McClellan in the Peninsula Campaign and helped keep McClellan at bay. He was wounded and replaced by Robert E. Lee. Well, now he's recovered from his wounds, and he is the overall commander of the West. He was given Bragg's job. General Bragg had been relieved of command because he'd had too many losses, too many complete epic collapses. We saw Perryville, we saw Murfreesboro or Stones River, where Bragg marched north and was driven back both times. I have to say, I didn't talk much about Bragg. He was a very cranky kind of guy. Nobody liked him. He had some physical problems, and they caused him to be extremely sensitive, extremely irritable. And when I was in college, Scott, as an undergraduate, I took a Civil War history class, and the teaching assistant or TA of the course was a really neat guy. He actually was a sergeant in a local reenactor company, which I joined for a few months anyway. And he famously said, well, I shouldn't say famously because nobody's heard this probably other than a few people, but he said the Confederacy lost the Civil War in 1848 when a shell rolled into General Bragg's tent, or Braxton Bragg's tent. He was just a lieutenant or something. This is during the Mexican War. A shell rolled into his tent and did not explode. That's how badly he felt about Bragg. He couldn't stand Bragg. He thought Bragg basically lost the war for the Confederacy. That may be too much of an exaggeration, but anyway, Bragg was out. Johnston is in again. And that really galled Jefferson Davis, because Jefferson Davis really liked Bragg, but he couldn't stand Joseph Johnston. But anyway, Johnston has 16,000 troops at Jackson, Mississippi, which is a little bit to the east of Vicksburg. And so Grant realized, if I start attacking Vicksburg and I've got my back to Jackson, well, what if Johnston comes in and hits me from behind, and then I'm surrounded? I can't have that. So Grant, instead of going straight to Vicksburg, he marches around Mississippi. He marches 180 miles. He fights 2 battles and wins both of them, Port Gibson and Raymond, fairly minor battles that nobody's heard of. He defeats 8,000 Confederate soldiers, and he also cuts Confederate rail and communication links. So he does a little bit of Forrest himself, doesn't he?
Yeah.
All right.